Okay, so this lecture is based on Catholic ethics in John Mazzoni's book, A Catholic Franciscan Ethics, and we're going to be looking particularly at the notion of ancient Catholic ethics. So we're looking at, when you're talking about what is right and what is good, what ought we to do from a Catholic perspective, this chapter from John Mazzoni's book traces the origins of the response to that question. What are the first ways that Catholics believe that we've been commanded to do right? And what are the rules that we're meant to follow, the virtues that we're meant to exhibit? Okay, so in the text, John Mazzoni opens with the parable of the Good Samaritan, one of the most famous parables in all of the biblical literature. And essentially what happens is there's this guy who is on the road, who's traveling, gets beaten up, gets robbed, is left on the side of the road to die. And a couple people pass by, people that are related to him in the sense of being of the same type of religion, being of the same culture, and they do not help him. But then the third person passes by, the Samaritan, who is not of his clan, of his kin, who'd be considered a stranger, who'd be considered perhaps an enemy, and he does, in fact, help him. And so this is really a pivotal story because Jesus tells it in response to a question about, well, who is my neighbor? Like, if we are supposed to do good, and if we are supposed to love God and love our neighbor, well, then the next question becomes, well, who is our neighbor? Who are we morally responsible to? And what is very instructive about this parable is just as much who the neighbor is not defined as who it is defined as. So the neighbor is not defined in this parable by belonging to a particular cultural political organization. Simply because you share a cultural political tie with someone does not mean that you are a neighbor to that person. The neighbor is not defined in terms of family. It's not simply because I am a family member that I am a neighbor to this person. The neighbor is not defined in terms of belonging to the same religion. The neighbor is not defined by belonging to the same economic class. The neighbor is not defined by looking the same or being part of the same sex. In this parable, the neighbor is defined in terms of virtue. The neighbor, or at least the good neighbor, is defined in terms of acting on virtues that make one neighborly. Compassion, kindness, concern, empathy, the ability to give, generosity. So the neighbor, who is your neighbor? The result of the story is, well, anyone can be your neighbor, but if you are going to be a neighbor, if you are going to be someone who is defined as a neighbor, you've got to act out of love, out of compassion, and act for anyone who is in need, act for anyone who is hurting. And so that's how Jesus defines the neighbor. Again, it's not simply because you share some kind of external bond or likeness with this person. Every single human being is our neighbor, and we act as a neighbor when we act for them. Okay, so then we can ask, well, what are the virtues that the Samaritan possesses? And the virtues, as we just talked about, compassion, generosity, love, concern, attention, all of those would be neighborly virtues, and virtues displayed by the Good Samaritan. Now, Mazzoni then goes on to define, okay, well, what are some of the foundational rules and moral guides in Catholic ethics? How do we find out what to do? Where are the first indications of the rules that we're meant to follow or the person we're meant to become? And so John Mazzoni talks about the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are obviously incredibly powerful, incredibly foundational. They are at the heart of Catholicism, of Judaism, and one might say of many Western nations. Okay, so these are a set of rules. Thou shalt love your God above all else. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. So on and so forth. So there's 10 of them, and certainly John Mazzoni enumerates them on page 11. And so they outline the kind of actions we're meant to do, but even more importantly, the kind of actions we're not meant to do. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord God in vain. Thou shalt honor thy mother, father, and by extension not disrespect them. Thou shalt, again, not kill, not steal. And we can think about these Ten Commandments certainly in terms of rules, because that's how they're stated, that's how they're formulated. But we can also think about them in terms of, well, what kind of person are they telling us to become? So we could translate the Ten Commandments into a set of virtue recommendations. We're supposed to become the kind of person, for example, that would be obedient, that would be respectful, that would avoid lust and thereby be temperate. And so you can kind of go through them and think about, okay, what is this commandment telling me to be? What kind of person? And there's going to be a lot of overlap, but it is a good exercise to do that. You know, they're rules, but they can also be formulated in terms of a communication about who we are meant to be. Okay. And obviously obedience, respect, and duty would be some of those. And it's interesting in the Ten Commandments, you know, they certainly could derive a characteristic out of it, but there's other virtues that are not obviously present in the Ten Commandments, and such as compassion or generosity. It's interesting that they are not there. And that's where we can go on to the Beatitudes. And John Mazzoni mentions this, how the Beatitudes and the Commandments can be kind of taken together in a holistic sense, and they can also be viewed as a gift to humanity. They are God's way of instructing us to become the best type of person that we can be. Now, the Beatitudes are a set of sayings by Jesus as part of a famous Sermon on the Mount, preaching to people, communicating to people about the nature of God and about God's love and about the kind of person we're meant to become. And these are also absolutely central to the Catholic tradition. These are, in a certain sense, Jesus' version of the Ten Commandments. Now, in terms of approach, they're different, and they're also different in content in some ways. In terms of approach, it's much less rule-based. It is much more virtue-based. In other words, Jesus in the Beatitudes is telling us to become a particular type of person, not so much follow a set of rules. Now, it's not black and white, there's overlap, there are some rules, but in essence, Jesus is saying, this is the kind of person I want you to become. And so, what kind of person are we meant to become based upon the Beatitudes? Well, that's an exercise, again, for you to do and kind of look at. Certainly the idea of being peaceful, being just, being humble, being pure. All of those kind of virtues are communicated as being important in the Beatitudes. This is the kind of person we're meant to become. Now, I think it's also interesting when I mentioned this before, the idea of a holistic ethics. When you take the Beatitudes and the Ten Commandments together, what do you get? Well, you get an image of a person that's meant to act a certain way, but also be a kind of person. There's this idea that, okay, Ten Commandments give you the rules, the Beatitudes give you the kind of the virtues, and taken together, they provide this picture of what we're meant to do in our kind of outer life, in terms of our efforts towards others, in terms of our actual decisions, but also the kind of creature and characteristics that we're meant to cultivate within ourselves. Taken together, they indicate that both actions and internal states matter. It's not one or the other. It's not like just become a particular type of person, and it's not just follow a certain set of rules. To be good, you've got to be following a set of rules, but also developing a particular character that is ultimately oriented to God and service to others. You could look at the Ten Commandments as saying, don't be excessive. In other words, don't be the kind of person that is so filled with lust, so desirous of another sex, that you're willing to kind of cheat on people or sleep with other people's spouses or girlfriends or boyfriends. Don't be the kind of person that is so envious of others that you steal. Don't be the kind of person that is so filled with rage that you are dishonoring your mother or father, or that you're killing. And ultimately, what both the Ten Commandments and the Beatitudes are meant to lead us towards is a notion of happiness. And this is important because there's a harmony in a Catholic and many times a religious worldview. One could argue that our two most basic elements of our existence as human beings is the call to be good and the call to be happy. you could say these are the two most primal urges that we have within ourselves, or at least two of the most basic. And in this Catholic view, ultimately being virtuous, being good, is meant to lead to being happy. Now, it's not necessarily in this life, and you can ask, well, does that undermine the harmony that the Catholic view promotes? Perhaps. But there is this deep faith that by being good, you will also be happy. And it's not that you're being good in order to be happy. It's not like virtue is simply a means to be happy. It is that the virtuous life, the good life, is itself happy. Hence, Jesus talks in the Beatitudes of blessed. In the ancient world, that would mean happy. Happy are those that care for others. Happy are those that hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake. Happy are those that are meek, so on and so forth. Okay, so you've got these foundational guides, the Beatitudes and the Ten Commandments, and then ultimately, at the basis of it all, if there's one kind of idea, one kind of disposition, one kind of attribute that is most important in terms of virtue, it is love. And John Mazzoni talks about how, well, love in the Catholic tradition is directed at a number of sources, a number of different audiences. You are to love your neighbors. And again, neighbors had this expanded sense in the Samaritan story. You're to love your enemies, the hardest of the principles, most often. Although some would say loving yourself can sometimes be the most difficult. Love of oneself, and ultimately love of God. That is the baseline. That is where everything comes from. So love is the primary responsibility. And you can also think about the commandments and the Beatitudes as love, as based on love. Love God above all else. And there's this kind of three first commandments are based on the love of God, and love of neighbor can be viewed as the principle animating Beatitudes, commandments 4 through 10. All right. St. Paul, then, he is someone who converted. He is someone who was persecuting Christians in the early Christian church. He was someone who would take and torture and murder Christians for their Christian religion. So it's very profound that God used him to become an instrument to fortify and to encourage and to express the beliefs, the thoughts, the feelings, the struggles, the hopes of this early Christian church. And so St. Paul is most famous not only for his conversion, but for his letters to these early Christian communities, where he's talking about issues that they face and giving them advice and trying to inspire them to keep on. And at the center of St. Paul's ethics is the idea of love. It is an ethic of love. And he sees this ethic of love as directly connected to the person of Christ. In fact, St. Paul could be viewed as one of the first people that uses or thinks about ethics in terms of the WWJD type of idea, type of mindset. What would Jesus do? And St. Paul says, if you're doing what Jesus would do, then you're on the right track. Then you are good. And what would Jesus do? Well, at the basis of Jesus' life and his ministry for St. Paul is the notion of love. Jesus loved. Okay, then the final section of this chapter, Dr. Mazzoni calls Christian virtues. And Christian virtues are most often broken up into the cardinal and the theological virtues, 7 total virtues. And the 4 cardinal virtues refer to those virtues that can be obtained through human effort. They're not specifically or necessarily religious. They can be common to human beings regardless of whether you're religious or not. And these 4 virtues are primary. These 4 virtues, as well as the 3 theological virtues, are the basis of all the other virtues, according to the Catholic tradition. So what are the 4 virtues? The 4 cardinal virtues are prudence. And essentially, this idea of prudence is not that you're just reserved or anything like that. It's that you're correctly able to understand and to do the right action. So you got to have a sense of context. You got to have a virtuous character in order not to react. You've got to be able to be reasonable, to be able to see what is the right thing to do in a particular situation. So it is applying morality to the real world, is the virtue of prudence. Justice is defined as giving to others what they are due. And that's others include God, include yourself, and include neighbors, and include everyone. Giving others what they are due. So we are meant to give God respect, for example. We're meant to worship him. God is due our worship. Others are due the right to their possessions, for example. That's why we cannot steal. If someone murders someone, or if someone does wrong, justice says they are due a punishment. That is what they have earned as a result of their action. Fortitude. Essentially, this is the ability to keep at it, the ability not to give up, the ability to fight through hard times, and to persevere. And especially when that perseverance requires one to be courageous and face danger and face persecution. And think about this in the early Christian church, where people could die because you are Christian, where you could be fed to the lions. I mean, fortitude is an absolutely central virtue. Temperance. Temperance is the idea that you balance the attraction of pleasures, desires, and instincts. That we don't simply indulge ourselves. That we don't simply do whatever we feel. That we're able to kind of, yes, enjoy life, but not to the excess where we're out of control. Or where we're driven by our instincts, where we're led by our desires. So you have these 4 cardinal virtues, then you get to the 3 theological virtues. Those 3 theological virtues are faith, hope, and charity. They are specifically religious in the sense that they are tied to religious belief. And they're also theological virtues in the sense that they are instilled in us, according to the Catholic tradition, by God. They're not things that we can simply produce on our own or accomplish on our own. We need the help and assistance of God. We need the guidance of God. We need the support of God to really fulfill these 3 virtues. So faith refers, according to the John Mazzoni's book, to the virtue of believing in God and what he has revealed. So this belief that God is real, the belief that God's revelations are true. Hope. Hope and faith are very closely connected, but hope particularly refers to the virtue of desiring eternal life in heaven. Not only that you believe in heaven, but that you want to go to heaven, that is the ultimate end. And heaven is ultimately unification of yourself with God. So it is basically boils down to the idea that you want to be with God, that you are meant to be with God, and that you want that outcome, as opposed to rejecting God, as opposed to wanting to do it on your own, as opposed to wanting to live without God. Finally, charity, which in the Catholic terminology and the Christian terminology is love. And it is the virtue of loving God and your neighbor, and we already talked about how that is foundational. That's the source of everything else. St. Paul says that is the preeminent virtue. That's what if you only got one thing, that's what you need, is love. Okay, and so that ancient Catholic tradition, again, is made up of rules to follow, is made up of recommendations about what kind of person we're meant to become. There you get the commandments and the Beatitudes. The centrality of love in the ancient Catholic tradition is absolutely clear. And St. Paul helps communicate that idea, and he helps reinforce the idea that ethics is based on following Christ. And then finally, we talked about the individual virtues that have been identified by the Catholic tradition as central, the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues.